Hello and welcome to Sunday Politics. This coming week marks a major policy moment for the new Labour government as it delivers its first autumn budget. We'll get the latest on what's likely to happen at Westminster and how it might affect people here. The Reverend Harold Good has been talking to me about his role away from the spotlight in the peace process and the day he knew Martin McGuinness was fully on board.
We came away saying, you know, that guy means business. We're going to have more conversation with him.
And with me throughout to discuss all of that and more, the editor of the Press Association in Ireland, David Young. The first truly big moment for the new government is nearly here. With the UK's finances under big pressure, according to the Chancellor, how do Sir Keir Starmer and those around him plan to take the country forward? And can they find the money to balance the books to their liking while keeping all the pre-election promises that were made? Let's ask Lucy Fisher, the Whitehall editor of the Financial Times. Lucy, welcome to the programme. Thanks for joining us. It's a big moment for Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves. And the question is, I suppose, very simply, can they deliver?
Well, look, you're right to say it is a seismic first budget for Rachel Reeves, the first Labour budget in 15 years. And I think that suspense has grown, the fact they've left it almost 4 months since coming into office to bring forward their first fiscal statement. It's shaping up to be potentially the biggest economic and fiscal budget ever in the UK's history. We've seen the Treasury sort of brief that the funding gap Rachel Reeves has identified is £40 billion. A small proportion of that, we think around £5 billion, might be achieved by spending cuts, but 35 odd billion we are expecting to come from tax rises. So that is a very tall order indeed. And unsurprisingly, speculation has really dwelt on which kind of groups are going to be hit in that huge tax raising exercise.
Yeah, and we've already heard some of the changes that are likely to be on the list: an increase in national insurance contributions from employers and a reduction in the threshold at which they kick in. I mean, there's been a huge amount of speculation about that, so I suppose that won't be a surprise if it happens. Do you think there'll be any shocks?
Well, look, I think that the row is going to be around tax and whether Labour misled, voters when it promised not to raise taxes on working people. There's been this huge debate about who counts as a working person. Keir Starmer and some of his cabinet colleagues making clear that people who earn over £100,000 don't fall into that bracket as far as they're concerned. People with savings, with shares and stocks, landlords, people who own second properties, again, don't fall into that bracket. So I think the wrangling from kind of Wednesday afternoon onwards will be, Conservatives, perhaps business groups, raising concerns about whether Labour has kept to its manifesto pledges, and Labour itself trying to land the two key messages of this budget as it would like it to be, which is firstly, no return to Tory austerity. I think, there will be this sort of push to sort of explain we need the tax rises in order to inject some cash into frontline services, particularly in the NHS, which is likely to be a winner. Feels like there's going to be a bit of extra money for education. And the second theme that Rachel Reeves wants to land is around investment. She is rewriting her fiscal rules to allow her to borrow more for capital expenditure. So again, she will be talking, we think, about sort of, piling more money into building new hospitals, perhaps new road and rail, could see a new HS2 link confirmed. We're expecting, we think, them to confirm that HS2 will go into Euston and not stop several miles outside central London. So that will be the wrangling between the sort of the battle of the narratives from Wednesday afternoon onwards.
Yeah, and the front page story on the Sunday Telegraph today, businesses shut up shop ahead of budget for growth, reporting that 1,600 bosses wind down their firms in the month before the Chancellor's feared tax raids. And then writing in one of the red tops today, Rachel Reeves says it'll be a budget for the strivers. But we have to imagine or guess who the strivers might be.
Well, it's clearly people on low to medium incomes. But again, even there, I don't think she's free from political jeopardy. One of the moves we're expecting from her is for her to freeze income tax thresholds for another year. They're frozen up to 2028. We expect her to confirm another year of freeze. That would be worth $7 billion to her. But again, that will drag a lot more people who certainly don't consider themselves wealthy, very much, medium earners, nurses, teachers, they will be dragged into paying higher rates of income tax, which, once upon a time were very much reserved for the wealthy. So again, I think there's going to be a big debate around that sort of decision as well, and what fiscal drag will do to sort of medium earners.
It is fascinating stuff. We will find out for sure on Wednesday, of course. I just want to talk about the Tory leadership race. We've got two competing for that position. Do you have a sense as to what way the wind is blowing at this point? Because it's nearly upon us.
Finally, after this very drawn-out contest, you're right, we'll know the result next Saturday. Look, the bookies think that they've got it sorted. It's definitely Kemi Badenoch. Her odds have never been shorter. Conservative Home survey, which isn't sort of scientific, it is self-selecting of members, that also indicates she's clinched it. And what I would say is, what I'm hearing from MPs, Conservative MPs, is that Kemi Badenoch is much more popular among members in London and the South. Robert Jenrick is more popular with members in the North and Midlands, and it's a numbers game. The vast majority of members are in London and the South, so that would suggest she perhaps has got this in the bag.
Yeah, and what will that mean for the dynamics of British politics, and particularly the House of Commons, when we see Keir Starmer facing Kemi Badenoch across the Commons chamber? That's going to be very interesting, isn't it?
It is. I'm looking forward to it. Popcorn at the ready. She's very combative in her style at the dispatch box. And I think that's one reason she's been popular with some quarters of the Conservative Party. They think she'll give Starmer a bloody nose every Wednesday when PMQs happens and the leader of the opposition gets to land a few blows. I also think it's going to be the start of a big debate in the party if she has one, because the big difference between her and Robert Jenrick is Jenrick has come up with quite a comprehensive suite of policies, leaving the ECHR being, primary and most eye-catching among them. Kemi Badenoch has said, no, we need to pause. I want to go back to first principles. I want to tell you about my character, where my sort of conservative principles come from. But she wants to kind of draw up a suite of policies with the party. So there's not as much fixed. And it will be interesting to see in coming kind of months, the kind of policy prospectus she draws up if she does indeed win.
OK, interesting stuff. Lucy, good to talk to you as always. Thanks very much indeed for joining us today. Let's hear from my guest of the day, David Young, who's been listening to that. Welcome, David. It's a big budget. Maybe people don't think budgets are the most exciting aspect of politics, but this is the stuff that really affects people most. So it's a big test for Labour. And Labour's been clear there will be no increase on tax for working people. But as Lucy's just explained, I think very well, it's not really as simple as that.
No, because it really defines on what's your definition of a working person. And we've heard in recent weeks how obviously Labour made that pledge coming into the election that there would be no tax increases, as you said, for working people. But it's their definition of that that's the real important thing. I suppose from our perspective, in Northern Ireland, it's going to be a very important budget as well, because we know Stormont at the moment is on course, if spending continues the way it is, for significant overspend. So they're relying very much in regard to getting something back from this budget, and a big sort of Barnett consequential boon. The Finance Minister projected that a few months ago to potentially being around 500 million. I'm not sure if that figure has changed given the various moves we know Labour are now going to do in terms of national insurance. That's good news for the executive, but it doesn't solve the problem. I mean, I think the overspend they're looking at is 750 million. That obviously then leaves still a gap that they still have there. And that's a double problem really, because failure to live within their budget this year will also bring back into play that debt that was supposed to be written off as we go back to when devolution was restored. That could potentially be heaped back onto the executive. So it's a really big budget for Stormont in that respect.
We know that proportionally speaking, we don't have a huge number of earners who are bringing home six-figure salaries in Northern Ireland, but we do have a lot of small and medium-sized businesses. And if there is an increase of 2% on national insurance contributions made by employers, and if the thresholds are adjusted downwards, that could have an impact on a lot of businesses here.
Not only do we have a lot of small and medium-sized businesses, but a lot of those the margins are so tight at the moment, and that's the issue with them. So while you may see extra money for public services in Northern Ireland, more money may potentially go into the health service, you'll also see a lot more businesses under real pressure, and that presents a problem for the Department of Economy and the wider executive as well.
Let's move from the UK to the Republic, and the big talking point, of course, or one of the big talking points, is when the election will be. Now, the smart money is on on the 29th of November, Friday the 29th of November. Do you think that's pretty much nailed down at this point?
Yeah, I think we're dealing in terms of diminishing options at the moment in regard to when the actual election could be held. I think what we're looking at is, obviously we're going into a week of recess now in the Dáil, and the week after that we're probably likely to see the election being called, potentially the Thursday of that week, and that would lead to a 3-week campaign with the election on November the 29th. Potentially it could go into December, but I think the smart money is on November 29th.
And it's been a challenging few weeks, we know, for Sinn Féin, and Sinn Féin did see itself as a party that was waiting to get into government, very annoyed that it wasn't in government after the last election, of course. And the papers today, you tell me if you think Sinn Féin's woes continue. We've got more information about the alleged incident that led to the Sinn Féin investigation into the party's former TD Brian Stanley, and then we've got a Red C poll in the Business Post.
Yeah, I mean, Sinn Féin's, their polling numbers haven't plunged in regard to the last few weeks, where they had some damning revelations. But the problem for Sinn Féin is their polling numbers have been down low for the last sort of almost 12 months, and it goes well beyond the recent controversies. I think their issue has been that for many years Sinn Féin had seen themselves and portrayed themselves as the anti-establishment party, the real alternative to Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. And I think maybe the last 12 months has muddied that in regard to, they took the same position as the government in terms of the referenda on the definition of family and care. Also, a lot of their base are unsettled in regard to the immigration issues, and maybe they see Sinn Féin as being too closely aligned with the government of that. So it's how Sinn Féin in this campaign, which it has to all intents and purposes started, but when the campaign for real starts, how Sinn Féin carve that position out again and present themselves as a real alternative to the government.
Yeah, it is interesting, and we do need to say it is a poll, and all polls are polls. And when you look at Fine Gael down 1%, Fianna Fáil up 3%, and Sinn Féin down 1%, they're all within the margin of error of plus or minus 3%. So you can read a bit into that, but you can't be sure. There's always only one poll that counts, as we know very well. David, thanks very much. We'll talk to you again a bit later in the programme. Now, a witness to IRA decommissioning hosting secret talks between the DUP and Sinn Féin, and playing a key role in getting loyalists to embrace the peace process. Not the typical CV of a Methodist minister, but the Reverend Harold Good isn't a typical Methodist minister. He's just published a book about his experiences, and when I spoke to him this week at his home outside Belfast, I began by asking him if he feels his early work with the Corrymeela community near Ballycastle helped with his later role in the peace process.
Yes, I think the time at Corrymeela in particular was important, because that was one of the things we felt we could offer, was to provide a very safe space where people from all sorts of backgrounds could come together and speak openly and honestly, not be observed, and build some kind of trust and relationship. And then I was able to build on that when I came back into parish life, and when others, not only myself, but others realised that we've got to try and find some way of getting people to engage with each other, because in those days the no-no was to talk to anybody who was seen to be your opponent or even different from you. It was not considered to be okay to talk across those barriers and those lines. Whereas some of us realised that the only way forward is to begin to build some kind of engagement.
Did you feel, though, that there was a sense of jeopardy for you to be engaging in private conversations away from the glare of the public, which no doubt some people in public life would have been offended by? Were you conscious of that at the time?
Well, I was never fearful. I never felt that this was going to put me at risk in any way. I knew it would bring criticism, but we can all live with criticism. In fact, if you're not getting some criticism, you're wondering, are you doing anything worthwhile?
IRA decommissioning was, of course, a major obstacle to political progress for quite some time during the peace process, and you were appointed as an independent witness to the process alongside the Redemptorist priest Father Alec Reid, who went on to become a very close friend. Why do you think you were asked to perform that sensitive task?
Yeah, Bob and asked that of myself. The only reason I can think of is that over many years, I and others had built that trust between ourselves and people from across the community and across what we call the divide. And so it wasn't just that it was plucked out of the air. We already had spent a lot of time building trust and building that relationship. I keep emphasizing the word trust, and it was on the basis of that trust, I think, that I was asked.
You also talk in the book about the importance of confidentiality. You say the most important code in peacekeeping is confidentiality, which must have made it very difficult for you to write this book.
Yes, that was a challenge. And I've tried to honour that confidentiality. I think if you read through the book, there is a chapter which talks about very sensitive conversations, but they were going to come in. Those conversations were going to come into the public domain because they're part of the history, they're part of the story of how we got to where we are. But apart from that, I have tried to be fairly strict in keeping to the confidentiality. As far as the decommissioning process itself, I have not gone into the detail of what we saw and did during that period.
Yeah, I was reading that passage last night and I was very struck with the parameters that you set. You don't name names, you don't go into the details of any of the locations or the process itself, but nonetheless you managed to convey a sense of the significance of what you were witnessing. But at the end of the day, and again, you're upfront about this, in a sense we have to take your word for it, don't we?
Yeah. People say to me, "What did you see?" And I said, well, use your imagination, and how would you go about this exercise? It'd be interesting just to let your imagination run wild. But I said, look, I'm not going to tell you what I saw, but I will tell you that what I heard was no less significant. In fact, I think even more significant. What I heard during that week was very significant. As I sat in the evenings listening and talking with people who were involved with us in that exercise.
And you did have fascinating conversations, obviously, with lots of people, not least, for example, Martin McGuinness. And I have no idea whether Martin McGuinness was part of that process or not, but I do know from reading the book that you had many conversations with Martin McGuinness, and he was in this house many times, sitting at your kitchen table with various people, including Jeffrey Donaldson. Would you say at the end of the process you were a friend of Martin McGuinness's? Would you go that far?
Oh, very much so. Very much so. I became a very close friend of Martin's. And there are stories in the book which illustrate that close friendship and respect that we had for each other. But it went beyond just a kind of respect. It was friendship, and a very warm friendship. Right up until shortly before he passed away from us, when I went to visit him in his home, and I was there as a friend and was welcomed as a friend, and we held each other in sorrow and in grief, as we knew it was going to be the last time that we would be together. And that was very poignant for us both.
Did you feel early on in that relationship that this was a man who had at some stage some kind of Damascene conversion? He had turned his back on the political violence with which he had engaged, and he admitted that he had engaged in the past as a senior IRA commander. Was he someone who was, in your view, fully committed to peace?
I've described the first meeting that when I say we, I'm talking about the Methodist Council on Social Responsibility. A small group of us went to meet Martin in his little office in a house above the Bogside, and that was the first time we had gone with our strong points that we wanted to put before him. He meticulously wrote down each question that we asked, and he answered it in such a way that we came away saying, that guy means business. We're going to have more conversation with him, because he clearly had understood where we were coming from, and we began to understand where he was coming from, and that was the beginning of a very important journey with Martin.
And what about that relationship that you saw developing between Martin McGuinness and Jeffrey Donaldson in this house, in the room just next to us.
Yeah, it was entirely respectful, open, and I wouldn't call it cosy, but it was very honest, and it came to a place of genuine trust, where they trusted each other with their own thoughts. And when we came to, for example, I talk about the policing and justice issue, they brokered with others that breakthrough in this home, and I saw them do it. They were very genuine and very respectful of each other and understanding of each other. That was hugely important. So they could understand why the other had problems at a particular juncture on the journey.
We've just marked, as you will know very well, the 30th anniversary of the Combined Loyalist Military Command's ceasefire, but the Loyalist paramilitaries, 3 decades later, are still engaged in the process of transitioning, and we know that elements within those illegal organisations appear to remain active. Can I just ask you, is that, in your view, acceptable?
Well, loyalism is a very broad spectrum, and I think we've heard that even from within their own circles. How broad is that spectrum? All I can say is that I have worked very closely with some elements from within loyalism who are, in my view, totally committed, and I found nothing to contradict this in the way in which they have been working towards resolving some of the issues to do with, for example, parades and bonfires, and do hope they will show that they are really committed to transitioning from where they were, and where some of them still are. But it's going to be a challenge to bring them all together with them on that journey, and there will be those who won't want to, just as there are dissidents on the Republican side, there are dissidents on the Loyalist side who don't have the commitment to a new way of living and sharing this place together.
Do you think, though, it would serve the cause of unionism better if those loyalists who haven't 3 decades on from that ceasefire transitioned were to get on with it, frankly?
In transition?
Yeah.
Oh yes. That's the challenge. That is the challenge. And somebody said it'll take much longer for us all to be in the place where we'd like to be, and it'll take much longer for everybody to be in the place where we would like them to be. But we've got to keep working on that and not give up on each other and still challenge each other. And that's why I don't subscribe to the notion that we should not talk to people, we should not talk to even those loyalists who are outside of the commitment to transition. We need to talk to everybody to try and bring everybody. If we leave anybody behind on any journey, we're never going to arrive where we'd wish to be.
Just a final thought about how welcoming this place is to outsiders. I mean, we saw violence targeted at people this summer simply because of the colour of their skin. Mm-hmm. And some of them were nurses. Some of them were business owners. None of them had done anything to deserve what happened to them. The makeup of this society is changing. How can we avoid a repeat of what we saw on the streets at the beginning of August, do you think?
When I was in the States, I understood that racism and sectarianism are 2 sides of the same coin. And we've got to be very careful that we do not tolerate just a switch from sectarianism. We've made a lot of progress on that front, but we must be very vigilant that we do not allow racism to take place of sectarianism. We've got to learn, if we want to have a society that we want to value and in which we want our children and grandchildren to grow, we're going to have to rejoice in diversity, not just tolerate it.
The Reverend Harold Good speaking to me last week, and his book In Good Time is published by Red Stripe Press. Let's have a final word with David. It's just interesting listening back to that. Some of the revelations in the book are from quite a few years ago, but Harold Good played a pivotal role, we can say, in stabilising Northern Ireland in what he did.
Indeed, he's a real eyewitness to so many significant junctures along the peace process. I suppose the comments that have drawn the headlines this week have been in regard to the talks between Sinn Féin and DUP ahead of that significant and seismic moment in the process when they sat down together in March 2007. I suppose they've been interesting in that respect, but I don't think maybe that's surprising because so much of the peace process was based on back channels and talks that, if they had been exposed at the time, probably wouldn't have happened. So yeah, interesting. Maybe embarrassing for the DUP today, but I suppose we're that much of a remove that it's really it's enough of a remove to take the sting out of it in terms of any sort of significant damage to the party. And the fact is, the DUP and Sinn Féin did sit down together and have been essentially leading the government for 15 plus years. So that's the reality of where we are. And obviously, the people who were involved there, some of them are still around in frontline politics today, but the majority are not. And
it is interesting, someone from Harold Good's background, that he should become so close to someone like Martin McGuinness. And obviously that was a very deep friendship. And he speaks quite emotionally there about that final meeting that they both had when Martin McGuinness knew that he was very unwell.
Yeah, and from the start of their relationship as well, the charting of that, development of that relationship from two men from very, very different backgrounds almost sort of encapsulates the peace process in certain ways. And yeah, that was a really striking part of that interview, how he described how they met in the Bogside and how that relationship developed.
Yeah, interesting too, given the current story surrounding the LCC, that Harold Good was happy to say loyalists cannot, should not, must not be left behind. Everyone has to be part of that conversation. But also very critical about the violence against people because of the colour of their skin over the summer that we saw.
Yeah, and I suppose his comments really speak to the unfinished legacy of the peace process, the fact that sectarianism is still such a key part of our society, and how that in itself has maybe fostered some of the incidents we've seen in regard to the racist incidents, and how both, as he said, both are the two sides of the same coin, and they both really need addressed.
Yeah, very interesting stuff. Got to leave it there. We're out of time. David, thank you very much indeed, as ever, for joining us today. That is all we have time for. There's no View this week or Sunday Politics next Sunday because of the half-term holidays, but I will be back with a special Red Lines podcast looking at the budget and what it means for everyone this Thursday, so you can look out for that on BBC Sounds or wherever you get your podcasts. Until then, from everyone in the team, thanks for watching. From all of us, have a good day. Bye-bye.